Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan in Ukraine's capital Kyiv, in a nation determined to defend itself a year into the war with Russia.
Fierce battles are raging on Ukraine's eastern front lines.
Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are dying in their thousands.
And Russian missiles are destroying homes and families in towns, villages, and cities across the country.
Millions have fled and face an uncertain future as refugees in many countries, including here in Poland.
But as Europe's biggest conflict since the Second World War grinds on, Western nations are rallying behind Ukraine with weapons and aid to confront Russia.
For President Vladimir Putin, the special military operation in Ukraine is about the very existence of Russia, a conflict he must win at all costs.
And all that's raising fears of a protracted or an even escalating conflict. Hello, I'm Darine Abougheida. You're watching an Al Jazeera special, Ukraine War, 1 year on.
"365 days of war and the grim toll of human suffering in Ukraine keeps growing. 1 year today, missiles, fighter jets and ground troops took part in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But as the war enters its second year, Ukraine, bolstered by its Western support, still stands. And President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has pledged to win the war against Russia this year. Al Jazeera's team of correspondents is here to take us through the different stages and aspects of the conflict. Zain Basravi is live here in Maidan Square in Kyiv. In the north, Hoda Abdelhamid is in Bucha, a town that witnessed the horrors of Russia's occupation in the early months of the war. But first, let's cross to Charles Stratford in Brovary, which was recaptured by Ukrainian forces last April. Charles, tell us exactly where you are and what happened there.
Hi Adrian, yes, you join us in the town of Brovary, in a place that is very significant in terms of an indication of the kind of challenges that Russian forces were going to face in the weeks and months ahead. What we saw here in the first couple of days of the war was a Russian armoured vehicle column that was approaching Kyiv from this direction. Now, the Belarusian and the Russian borders are around about 180 or so kilometres in that direction. Kyiv, or the outskirts of the capital, are around about 15. We saw this column come into Brovary and was basically ambushed by Ukrainian forces, we understand, on both sides of the road. Ukrainian forces trying to use what is understood to be mortars and anti-tank weaponry, hitting both the first and the last vehicle in this column. Scenes of absolute chaos and panic, as you can imagine, the Russian forces in these vehicles. And what they were trying to do was trap that column and prevent it from moving so they could basically smash and destroy every vehicle in it. They didn't succeed to 100%, and the Russians were able to withdraw. But as I say, it was largely seen as an indication of the kind of poor planning, poor logistics that the Russians had at the beginning of the war. That's according to military analysts. The question being asked was, what were Russian forces doing travelling along a road like this, so exposed, a main thoroughfare into Kyiv, without, for example, infantry support to try and defend themselves against the kind of ambush they suffered. And of course, it was about 3 weeks later where Russian forces, as you alluded to in the intro, were forced to withdraw from this area around Kyiv on April the 1st, April the 2nd. But yeah, a very important moment in the war because it gave such hope as well to the Ukrainians that they could actually defend the capital.
Meanwhile, Charles, there is intense fighting ongoing in the east. Bring us up to speed on that.
That's right, yeah. Fighting continues. Very intense around that flashpoint city of Bakhmut in the east, which has been going on, fighting there for months. It's become particularly intense in the last few weeks, though. We know that Russian forces have taken control of villages to the south of Bakhmut. They control the western sections, and in the last week or so, certainly we're hearing reports from the Russians that they've taken control of another town just south of Solidar. They're trying to encircle Bakhmut. We know that estimates are potentially thousands of soldiers on both sides have been killed in the battle for Bakhmut. We also understand that there is ongoing fighting to the south of Bakhmut, in and around the town of Avdiivka. That's close to Russian-occupied Donetsk. Incredibly, there's been very little movement there since the beginning of the war. We also know, though, that there is heavy fighting to the south of Avdiivka, around the flashpoint town of Ugledar. Ukrainian military experts saying that they believe that the Ukrainians are trying to basically suck in Russian forces into these flashpoint towns, basically to try and destroy as much of their military equipment and their infantry as they can. And there's also a lot of fighting going on along the Lugansk-Donetsk border around the town of Liman. Now, Liman was recaptured by the Ukrainians in their autumn offensive. It seems like Russian forces now are trying to push them back.
Charles Stratford reporting live there from Brovary. Charles, many thanks. Let's go live now to Bucha on the other side of Kyiv, where Al Jazeera's Hoda Abdelhamid is standing by. The town, Hoda, where you are, endured and survived an occupation. Talk us through what happened there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what happened in Bucha came really to represent, on one side, the horrors that the Ukrainians had to go through in the first stages of the war, and also the poor military planning by the Russians. Now, this seems like a quaint crossroad, but this, at some point, was the most iconic image of that first month of the war. Through this main street here, a column of Russian tanks had pushed from the north and were trying to push further down towards the town of Irpin and then maybe reaching Kyiv. This is where they got bogged down. At some point further down the road, a petrol truck belonging to the Russians was hit. That caused a huge fire, and the whole column came to a standstill. Now, what we're showing you now is another street that is famous for all the wrong reasons. It's called Apple Street, and this is where, after the Russians pulled out, that the world actually discovered the horrors that happened in this town. Further, a little bit further down that road, you had all these images of body strewn all over the streets there. Some of them were blindfolded, some of them had their hands tied behind their backs, executed point blank. And then further down, there's also a church where also bodies were found nearby, mass graves were found. So Bucha, when the reality of what happened in Bucha during that 1 month occupation by the Russians emerged, it shocked everyone, not only in Ukraine, but around the world. It was really the beginning of the talk about war crimes, but clear evidence of war crimes. And I remember coming here a couple of weeks later, and investigators were still finding bodies randomly buried by the side of roads, in backyards, in the woods, of all people that had to be exhumed, recognized. And so it's from here that Ukraine started building its war crimes file and started alerting the world at the horrors of the Russian occupation.
And we'll be talking more, Hoda, about that a little later in the programme. For the moment, though, many thanks indeed, Hoda Abdelhamid there in Bucha. Joining me here is Emenia Zaporova, who is the Deputy First Minister here in Ukraine, Foreign Minister, I'm sorry, here in Ukraine. Thanks for being with us on Al Jazeera. I just, first of all, want to ask you about a development this morning with China proposing to step in as a peace mediator, a negotiator between Ukraine and Russia. What do you think of that proposal?
Well, we do welcome any initiative that actually is aimed at finding peace and resolving the war, because we are the country that is the most interested in having any kind of peace, because we've been suffering this hell for a year. The document and the, let's say, piece of information that we received today in the morning is called the political its position of China about the crisis, as they call in Ukraine. We will study it thoroughly, but as I said, we welcome any initiative that is aimed at peace. But the only thing that I want to clarify is what is the basis for this peace? Because we believe that justice and fair peace should be not appeasement. This is a great and big difference.
What did you make of yesterday's vote at the UN calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops? How does that help Ukraine?
It helps a lot because it shows that the international unity is there. 141 votes that we managed to collect to the peace formula of President Zelenskyy that he initiated a G20 summit recently. And actually in this resolution we have some of the parts of this peace formula, which is a clear plan of how is the Ukrainian vision is there. And we believe that without nuclear, without food security, without withdrawal of Russian army, without free of political prisoners and prisoners of war, without something that is a very basic things, peace is not possible. So we believe that the resolution that has been voted yesterday in Anga is a clear demonstration and something that kills Russian narrative that world is not united, that has been divided. And I think that the main reason why we actually initiated this document is to clearly say, as I said, that appeasement is not the language that we have to talk to Putin. That if we speak about the peace, we have to understand what is this formula. And our president was very clear in saying what exactly we want.
You've had a lot of foreign leaders visiting this week, the President of the United States, the leaders of Italy, Poland and Spain. Is that the kind of support that Ukraine needs right now? How important is that symbolism?
Look, absolutely. A year ago, let me just bring you to this flashback of a year ago. We were desperate. We were so scared. A year after, we have no fear and we're full of hope because we managed to demonstrate this unity. Because I believe that if you take the modern history of the humankind, there is no any case like Ukraine that managed to collect that support that we have. Well, of course, we still don't know what's going to be the result of this war. We can only have a hope, but I believe that this is in our hands. I mean, our future is in our hands, and I believe that we can manifest life, we can manifest this dignity with our actions, with our words, with something that we are trying to do, and this is of our common future. And I'm sure that this war is not only about Ukraine, because let us just imagine that Putin won, that he actually succeeded in doing what he wanted. But do you think that he would stop? Because whenever aggression is not stopped, it becomes bigger. We had it in 1938 when we had several countries appeasing Hitler, even after Anschluss of Austria and takeover Sudetenland. And just in 1 year, the Second World War started. So I'm sure that if the war is not contained in Ukraine, it will become bigger.
Emilia Zaporova, many thanks indeed for being with us. Now then, let's get to my colleague Zain Basravi, who's in downtown Kyiv. He's in Maidan Square, actually, just below us here. Zain, how are Ukrainians in the capital marking the day their nation came under attack 1 year on?
Well, Adrian, there's no large gatherings or any sort of unity rally or anything like that that you might expect from a country at war in this way, and that is because this is still a place under martial law, and the concern is any sort of mass gathering could be targeted by the Russians, and they don't want any more mass casualty events during this conflict whatsoever. So we haven't seen anything major. There are small events happening throughout the city. We've seen a lot of people attending church services. We were at one earlier today where we saw soldiers going in and lighting candles and praying, likely for a safe return from the battlefronts that they're off to. We saw people lighting candles and praying for loved ones and also praying for those that have departed. It's been a very, very bloody conflict for soldiers and for civilians. Now, there are no official numbers published, but to get a clear sense of exactly how many lives have been lost, you can look at the square where these flags are planted. Now, I can tell you I was here at the start of the conflict a year ago, and you could count the number of flags on both your hands. There was just in the dozens, and now there's hundreds, and these are just here as a sign to commemorate. People come here, they bring a flag, they'll put the name of a loved one on it, and they'll put it in the ground as a form of remembrance. And everyone we talk to say it's the same thing. They just want to return to peace. They don't want to put any more flags in the ground or any more loved ones in the ground. They want to return to normalcy. And one of the things we keep hearing is that people are worried about the next generation. They're worried about the children, and they want their kids back in school. But the students that are attending school have to deal with all the same problems of getting an education, as well as Russian missiles and drones and threats from the sky. Some schools have reopened, retrofitted with makeshift bomb shelters, and we visited one in Irpin to try to get a sense of the reality of being a student in wartime Ukraine.
Far from the fighting, children in Ukraine are still connected to it by family members on the front line and the more immediate threat of bombs from the sky.
My children get scared when there is an air raid siren. They know what to do, they hide. But the first time my son was crying, he told me he was very scared. He thought that everyone will die and his mum was not close by. Our children do not deserve that. They should not be asking if rockets were launched or not.
Parents we met said schools, central to their community and to stability in their children's lives, were not spared in Russia's bombardments. UNICEF estimates half of all schools across Ukraine are too damaged to reopen, and 2/3 of its children are unable to access any kind of education.
Some of the schools in areas that were held by the Russians are so heavily damaged from shelling that it will take millions of dollars and years before they're ready to open for students again.
One school principal said in the aftermath of Russia's occupation of his hometown, reopening classrooms meant making sure parents felt safe enough to send their children back. With the help of international donors, this school in Irpin converted a storage basement into an air raid shelter. The plan is to build spaces like this in as many schools as possible.
The biggest concern for us is the children. They're our children, and we are responsible for them. That's why at the beginning of the school year, we organize first aid classes and psychological training to cope with fear. When we have sirens, all the children automatically come to the shelter. They know how to respond and what to do.
But it is not ideal. The student body at this school numbered in the thousands before the war. Now only 200 children attend at a time, and only for a few hours a day, because that is the maximum number of children that will fit in this shelter. School schedules made to accommodate the threat of Russian attacks. It is purpose-built to be child-friendly, but not fortified or deep enough to withstand a direct hit. Every time an air raid alarm stops and the all-clear sounds, the hope is they will never have to use it again. Zain Basravi, Al Jazeera, Irpin.
UN investigators say that there's evidence that war crimes have been committed during the conflict. They visited Ukraine, focusing on areas where the most serious allegations were made against Russian or Russian-backed forces early in the war. They saw civilian areas that have been destroyed and places where people were detained or tortured. The team documented unlawful killings, including the summary execution of civilians and sexual violence. It says that Ukrainian forces were also responsible for rights violations, but that significantly more crimes were committed by Russian troops. Joining me here now is Yuri Bulasov, who is head of the War Crimes Department at the Prosecutor General's office here in Ukraine. Welcome, sir. Thank you for being with us. How many war crimes are you currently investigating?
By this morning, we have more than 69,000 war crimes been registered for the last year.
And do you intend to prosecute all those crimes?
Yes.
How? I mean, that's such a huge number.
Yeah, exactly. That's why at the first stage we are trying to fix everything, not to lose any evidences we have. Then on the next stage we are trying to see, based on some priorities, which we should focus first. For example, if there is attacks on civilian infrastructure where we have civilian people being killed, that's our priority number one. Then the second step, fixing the evidences for other types. And sure, we are trying to structure our investigations, to use modern technologies of gathering evidences, using IT solutions to give us a chance to work with this workload.
A significant number of people remain missing. You said that there were how many? 68,000?
68,000 war crimes.
Yeah, okay. Yes. Will that number rise when you find out what has happened to these missing people?
Sorry?
Will that number rise further, do you think?
Absolutely. When we have access to occupied territories of Ukraine, we are sure that we would face much more terrible situation and much more crimes.
Are you confident, though, that justice will be served, given that defendants in any war crimes prosecution may be unreachable in Russia? And how far up the chain of command do you intend to go?
We are confident because it's not just a matter of Ukraine. The whole world supports us. We have supports from more than 20 countries who started their own investigations. We have a support from International Criminal Court. And all our forces have been focused on gathering evidences. That's why we are sure that we would prosecute. It would take time. Someone would be prosecuted in our national courts. Someone would be prosecuted in other countries. But if this situation will not be punished, so it gives a chance to other countries to do the same as Russia is doing against Ukraine.
So where will you try these crimes? Is this something that the international...
Yes, we're in good touch with International Criminal Court, which is working head by head with us on a daily basis. And we are sure that top leaders of Russian federations will be prosecuted in international
court. The Ukrainian legal system, the Ukrainian court system can't cope with that number of cases if you bring a woman to trial.
Sure, the whole system is shocked. The criminal justice system is shocked with such a number of cases. That's why, but we are trying, we have no other option but not to get the justice in our national jurisdiction.
And how do you go about investigating war crimes?
So we have prosecutors team who are specializing on that. We have regional teams, which are in Kherson, in Mykolaiv, in Kharkiv, who on a daily basis fixing evidences, putting data in databases. Our international partners are on the ground with us. We have teams from France, from Spain, from Lithuania, who come and help us.
Good to talk to you, Yuri. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera. Now, let's go to the metro here in Kyiv. Ukraine's system has become a source of safety for thousands of people who shelter in metro stations during air raids, as Alexei O'Brien reports.
Descending deep below the Ukrainian capital, these escalators carry crowds of commuters to Kyiv's Golden Gate metro station, about 90 metres underground. It's below freezing at street level. Down here, it's even colder. But people don't mind the temperature because at least it's safe. There's an air raid alert as we film, so young and old gather in the station until it's lifted.
We've come down here because there's a threat in the center of the city. We always come down here.
Sure, I'm worried. I hope all this madness will come to an end and that the Russians will experience everything we've lived through.
Fewer people come down now than in the early days of the war, when the city was encircled by Russian forces and thousands lived underground for weeks. Platforms and trains became makeshift camps, crammed with people and their pets, and the few belongings they could carry. Lesya Snegur was on night shift at Lukanyevska metro station when the first explosions struck.
My friend called me at 5 a.m. and said the war has started. I couldn't believe it. Then we heard the sirens and people started to run to the metro to ask for shelter. There were so many people and they were scared.
She tells me how she lived in the station for 2 months, helping organize food and sanitation for the crowds of terrified people.
As the head of the station, I couldn't leave those people behind because I knew they needed my help. And when I saw the fear in their eyes, I could not leave.
One of the challenges for those running Kyiv's metro system, but also systems across the country over the past year, was how to keep people safe whilst also keeping the trains running.
Now about 500,000 people ride these trains every day, determined to keep life as normal as possible, as up above, the war grinds on.
I believe everything will be fine. If there are any future attacks, we'll be ready. We feel positive.
These stations that were once tourist hotspots are now places of refuge and symbols of Ukraine's resilience. Alexei O'Brien, Al Jazeera, Kyiv.
1 year into the war, one of the world's biggest military superpowers, Russia, hasn't been able to make substantial gains in Ukraine. Kyiv still stands, and so does its government. Live to Moscow with Osama bin Javed. So, Osama, has the war altered Russia as a nation, as well as the perception of President Putin as its leader?
Well, in the last year, a lot has changed. A year ago, there were sanctions almost every day being piled on Russia. Tens of thousands of people had left Russia. That included the brightest and the best that it had. But in a year, there seems to be a change of opinion. People have now come round to the narrative that has been built by the Russian government that this is an existential war. This is a war that Russia had to go to because it had no other choice, because it is fighting a coalition of countries, not just Ukraine, and it calls Ukraine a proxy army. It has been able to tell its people that in the past year that an alliance of countries came together and wanted to destroy Russia. They wanted to decapitate the Russian leadership. It's been telling its people that they have failed in breaking Russia's economy, in defeating Russia's military, or isolating Russia internationally, a proof of which is today when China has presented its peace plan, which remains a steadfast partner for Russia. So despite all of these sanctions, despite so much being pulled out of Russia, Russia has been able to withstand it. It has been able to circumvent a lot of these sanctions, and life goes on in the Russian capital as well. Although without those many recognizable international brands, those stations, those coffee shops, those cafes are still open despite them changing their names to Russian ones and ownership changing to Russia.
This Moskvich 3 is a standard 1.5-litre family car, but it comes off the production line of what used to be a Renault production plant. When the French car manufacturer left Russia last year, it wrote off $2.3 billion worth of assets and sold its Russian subsidiary for a symbolic €1. It has a buyback option in a few years if sanctions are lifted. But for now, the 45,000 workers who produce nearly a third of Russia's car market remain employed. Yet it seems one company's sanctions crisis was another's opportunity.
In 2023, we plan to produce 50,000 vehicles. 10,000 will be electric. We've already started developing our own electric platform. By the end of 2025, we plan to produce a fully electric car of our own design. We plan to localize all components in Moscow.
Fast food chains and cafes which closed operations have also been acquired by Russian business people. So McDonald's is now Vkuzno i Tochka and Starbucks is Stars Coffee in Russia.
More than 11,000 sanctions have been imposed during this year. They assumed that events would unfold in a catastrophic way. Russia's exports would go to zero. Russia would fall into a complete blockade. The financial system would collapse. However, they were wrong.
These countries have either imposed restrictions, backed sanctions, or opposed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the ones in green are either seen as Russia's allies or have a neutral stance. These include South America's Brazil and Venezuela, plus resource-rich nations including Iraq, Mali and Sudan, and Asia's powerhouses including India and China.
This is the Kalashnikov group showcasing its weapons in the United Arab Emirates. It's one of many countries that refuse to be involved in sanctions against Russia. The Russian manufacturer produces about 95% of all small arms in the country and exports weapons to more than 27 others. Russian drug makers have turned to India's pharma industry for supplies after being blocked by the West. India has also become a major oil export market for Russia. But China dwarfs them all with an estimated $200 billion in trade forecast with Russia by next year. Despite its allies' help, sanctions against Russia have led to a drop in exports, a widening fiscal deficit, and businesses struggling to find cash after banking restrictions. 1 year on, Moscow has proved an old military saying, Russia is never as strong as you fear, but Russia is also never as weak as you hope. Samba bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, NATO has been expanding eastwards. Russia sees that as a threat to its national security. So NATO has brought into its orbit countries like Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic, which were earlier with the Soviet-led communist bloc. Also with NATO now, the 3 Baltic states, which were part of the Soviet Union. And in 2008, NATO made a vague promise that Ukraine would one day join the bloc. In 2014, Ukraine's pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown by mass protests in what became known as the Maidan Revolution. Within days, armed men seized control of the parliament in Crimea and raised the Russian flag. And within days, Moscow annexed the territory. Later that year, pro-Russian separatists in the eastern region of Donbass declared independence. In 2021, the newly elected Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy revived talks to join NATO. Moscow began massing tens of thousands of troops near Ukraine's borders over several months. And by December, Russia gave NATO and the U.S. a list of demands. They included barring Ukraine from joining the bloc. It also wanted NATO to pull back troops and weapons from Eastern Europe. NATO and the U.S. said no. Well, in February 2022, President Vladimir Putin launched what he called a special military operation, saying that he was left with no other option to protect Russia as well as its people. Well, to get more insight into President Putin's motivation, we're joined by Philip Short. He's written his biography, appropriately titled Putin. Philip Short, you're joining us from Isolé in France. Welcome to Al Jazeera. So, President Putin portrays himself as a strong man. Would the decision to go into Ukraine have been made by him and him alone?
Yes, very much so. The Russian system that he has created is based on different constituencies which support him, but ultimately it's Putin who decides. And this would not have happened had he not wanted it.
Right, and the appeal to history is central to Putin's communication effort, as we see just a few days ago when he gave his annual speech. So could that give us an idea of what his next moves might be?
Well, I think it explains a lot about his motives. Putin saw bringing Ukraine to heel, subjugating Ukraine, bringing it back into the Russian world, as he would put it, as what was going to be the crowning achievement of his career. It would be a major part of his legacy. And of course, it hasn't worked out that way at all. But the fact that he saw it in historical terms is yet another thing which makes it clear he's not going to back away. He's going to double down and continue until he has something which he can present as a victory, something which, in the historical sweep of things, in his mind, will give him a place, will give him a legacy which Russians will remember.
Right, and how do you think that he's viewed amongst Russians today? Obviously, polling is hard to come by in the country.
Polling is hard to come by, but Levada, which is the one independent poll institute, basically gets things pretty right. I mean, there are three groups in Russia. There are a very small group who are completely opposed to the war and say so. There is a slightly larger group which is completely in favor of the war and wants even more to be done. And the vast majority, something like 65, 70% of the Russians, go along with what the authorities do. They don't support it very enthusiastically, but they don't oppose it either. And fundamentally, because the country is at war, and it's Russia and it's their country, they line up behind the regime.
And as the past year has unfolded and now the war enters its second year, what's been the most striking Putin moments for you?
Well, I think the fact that he didn't get what he wanted and he's had to readjust. I mean, he really believed that there would be a kind of blitzkrieg, a lightning of a short, victorious war, which he'd win with very little bloodshed. And when he didn't get that, he's had a very difficult readjustment to fighting a war of attrition, which is going to go on for years, and Russia's going to be on a war footing. And it's the kind of war that he didn't want. But now he's got it, and he's having to deal with it, and he's doubling down.
And from your research, what did you learn about Putin that could give us insight into how we actually got here today?
Well, we got to where we are today through a very, slow, incremental process. And your introduction, you mentioned the whole business of NATO expansion. Now, that's part of the background. I mean, Putin originally wanted Russia to be in harmony with the West, and he saw Russia as part of Europe. And gradually, he became disillusioned. He did things which the West hated. The West did things which he hated. And over 20, 25 years, things have got to the present past, to where we are today. Now, you can say, well, the West could have done things differently. That's certainly true. But Putin didn't have to declare war. You know, there were other ways of dealing with this. So both sides have a certain responsibility, but the fundamental responsibility for where we are today is Putin's. He's the one who calls the shots.
Philip Short, we thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Now, at the beginning of the war, Russia's armed forces dwarfed Ukraine's military. Yet, despite that, Moscow's advances were often brought to a halt. Al Jazeera's defense editor Alex Gotopoulos looks now at how the numbers stack up on both sides.
At the start of the conflict, Russia's military was huge. Supposedly better trained, its forces massively outweighed Ukraine's military, as the numbers show. Russia's armed forces active personnel numbered 900,000, with another 2 million in reserve. Ukraine's military was dwarfed at 196,000, with only 900,000 in reserve. Russia's colossal tank fleet numbered 2,927 tanks, with 10,000 in reserve, whilst Ukraine, pre-war, was only able to field 858. Ukraine's artillery at the start of the war numbered 1,818, while Russian artillery numbers stood at a huge 4,894. Russia has 1,391 combat-capable aircraft, outnumbering Ukraine's meager complement of 132 jets by over 10 to 1. Yet despite the disparity in huge Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian air bases, Russia was still unable to suppress Ukraine's air force and dominate the skies over Ukraine. Time and again, Russian jets were shot down, and the Ukrainian Air Force still operates today, a year after the invasion. Ukraine's navy is limited to a few coastal vessels, while Russia has its Black Sea Fleet based in Sevastopol, with its complement of 5 frigates, 6 submarines, and 10 landing ships. The fleet even has its own air wing and 2 brigades of well-trained naval infantry. Even with this overwhelming advantage in numbers, Russia was unable to achieve most of its strategic goals, and in some cases, even the small advances made were repelled. Troops have been vital for both sides as losses mount after 12 months of high-intensity conflict, with some estimates as high as 100,000 casualties each.
The world's biggest military alliance, NATO, is supplying advanced weapons and training to Ukraine. Estonia, which is a member of the bloc, has gone a step further and pledged more than 1% of its GDP in military support to Kyiv. Today, the Baltic nation, bordering Russia, is celebrating its Independence Day, and feelings of nationalism are running high. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, is live for us in the capital, Tallinn. James, on the day when Estonia marks its independence from Russia, another former Soviet nation is in an all-out war with what is now modern-day Russia.
Absolutely, Adrian. You can see behind me people gathered around some military hardware in this square in the last hour. It was the Independence Day celebrations, as you say. Estonia was celebrating or marking its independence from Russia in 1918, but of course later, after World War II, it was subsumed again into the Soviet Union. They have a long history and are very wary of Russia in this country. The day was about Estonia independence, but also we had the presence of the NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Brussels came to Tallinn today, and so it was also, I think, about the future independence of Ukraine. Estonia, one of the frontline nations of NATO. What's happened in the last year, as you heard Alex say a moment ago, is you've seen a really enhanced presence by NATO since the full-scale invasion 1 year ago. There were 4 battle groups of NATO before, one of them in Estonia. Now there are 8 battle groups. The number of troops has doubled in terms of the NATO troops that are in the NATO members, which are closest to Russia. And there is still a real worry here, I think, among ordinary Estonians who are facing an election in the next week or so about what happens next. The Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, she told me that they are very fearful that if Russia was to succeed in Ukraine, if Russia was to defeat the government in Kyiv, then the Baltic states, Estonia, for example, they could be next.
James May is our diplomatic editor there, live in Estonia's capital, Tallinn. James, many thanks. The US has committed nearly $30 billion in military aid to Ukraine since the war began. That's almost double the pledges by other NATO members put together. And it's been a boon for weapons manufacturers as they rush to sign new contracts.
The past year has seen bloodshed and battles during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But for William Hartung, weapons makers in the United States see something else in Ukraine: profits.
We're talking tens of billions of dollars.
Yes, exactly. Hartung, who wrote a book about how arms makers profit in times of war, says America's top weapons manufacturers are benefiting by replenishing U.S. stockpiles of weapons the Pentagon has sent to Ukraine, and also by selling new weapons to Ukraine's regional allies, who now feel the need to arm up in fear of Russia.
Well, not only have they profited, but they'll profit for some years to come, because some of the equipment was given from Pentagon stocks, and the companies will get paid to replenish that. Probably replenish more than is used in the war, sometimes more sophisticated, more costly systems. And so we have to watch that, because there could be some war profiteering that goes on over time.
And how much money are we talking here?
Well, the commitment so far has been $30 billion to Ukraine and European allies on the front lines. So most of that will go to the contractors.
Raytheon received more than $2 billion for its NASAM and Stinger surface-to-air missile systems. Lockheed Martin, $1.1 billion for its high-mobility artillery rocket system known as HIMARS. And among the long list of other equipment going to Ukraine from U.S. arms makers, 31 Abrams tanks made by General Dynamics, more than 100 million small arms ammunitions, and over 8,000 Javelin shoulder-mounted weapons made by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. In a phone call with investors, Raytheon's CEO Greg Hayes suggested the company could make a lot of profit off the war in Ukraine. He was later asked about that comment.
I make no apology for that. I think, again, recognizing, we are there to defend democracy. And the fact is, eventually, we will see some benefit in the business over time.
Weapons of war bring tragedy to those killed, but profits for the companies who make them. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera, New York.
As the war grinds on, millions of Ukrainian families remain separated. More than 8 million Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries since the start of the war, most of them women and children. Poland has welcomed the most, with around 1.5 million people settling there. Germany is hosting an estimated 1 million Ukrainian refugees, but like many countries, it's faced challenges, especially in providing proper housing and services. The Czech Republic took in around 500,000 people. It's one of 27 EU nations where Ukrainians are allowed to live and work for up to 3 years. Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull is at the Polish border city of Przemyśl, where he caught up with some refugees who hope to return home one day.
In a Polish auditorium, Ukrainian refugees watch a film comparing the World War II destruction of Warsaw with last year's Russian bombardment of Mariupol. Warsaw was rebuilt and rose shiny and new from the ashes. So too, the thinking goes, will Ukraine's devastated cities like Mariupol. On a guided tour of Warsaw later, where traces of the war still remain, some feel only faint hope.
The
Mariupol we had will never be the same. It'll be different. We cannot know how, but the life we had there will never return. That life was stolen from us.
Hope is a common ingredient in the lives of Ukrainian refugees scattered the world over, a large proportion benefiting from the generosity of neighbouring Poland. But the warmth and safety of sponsored accommodation is no barrier to pain.
March 20th was a more or less quiet day, so we left the basement, and I remember it was my daughter's birthday.
Nor to the realization that what began as a temporary relocation could last much longer. And while there are those returning to safer parts of Ukraine, especially as winter lifts, many continue to flee the fighting in the south and east. Trainloads of newcomers arrive on Poland's eastern border almost every day.
We sold everything just to have money to come across.
You sold all your belongings?
Yeah. Even books. It was too hard. And here, only my mom.
Since the war began, more than 8 million people have disembarked trains like this one from Ukraine, many of them going on to settle in countries all over the world, while Poland alone has taken in around 1.5 million. And this country's generosity now being sorely tested as the war goes on. In recent years, Poland has become infamous for its unwelcoming attitude to migrants from Africa and the Middle East trying to cross the border from Belarus. Not so those from Ukraine. But while the country spends billions of dollars supporting them, and as the cost of living soars, the hope that they'll one day be able to leave Poland is not felt by the Ukrainians alone.
And Jonah is live for us now at a refugee reception centre near the Polish-Ukrainian border. Jonah, as the war enters its second year, there are still many Ukrainians arriving there in Poland.
Adrian, that's right. Look, it's not the chaos that it was in the early days and weeks of the war, of course, when millions of people very, very quickly fled Ukraine in panic and terror. It's much more organised now. It's much calmer. Yes, people are arriving every day in reception centres like this. At any given moment, there are several hundred people being looked after, of course, by a small army of volunteers and NGO workers. One of them is with me now, Anna Mizniak, with the Polish Red Cross, joins me. Anna, thanks for being with us. You were here right at the very beginning. You've seen this all through the last 12 months. It's not as bad as it was then, but people are still coming, aren't they?
Yeah, so during the last year, the situation was very different. I was here on the all stages. Right now, the amount of people is smaller, but still coming regularly.
What sort of numbers?
So right now we have capacity of 300 and the center is full. Previously, that was even 3,000 at the beginning of the war every day.
But I hear that now we're talking about several hundred people per day arriving in Ukraine?
Yeah, so there are still many people. Last day it was around 2,000 people coming with the train station, and then hundreds coming to us every day.
And what sort of things, briefly, do you try to do? What sort of help do you try to give them here?
So we are here to give them the first help, the bed, something to eat, showers, psychological help, anything that they might need at the very first moment in Poland.
And you also help them logistically to plan the rest of their journey, to decide where they may go next, whether into Poland or elsewhere.
Yes, so if they have plan, we help organize them the way with a plan. If not, we try to find some places for them here locally also.
Well, I'm sure you're a very welcoming presence for all of them. But of course, Poland particularly has really shouldered an enormous burden in terms of these arriving Ukrainian refugees. Poland has a pretty tricky history with Ukraine. What sort of burden, you're Polish yourself, what sort of burden has been placed on the shoulders of Polish society by this huge exodus?
I think the war that happened here was really surprising for us, but I think Polish people did their best, and we still help as much as possible with volunteering, food. People were bringing anything they had at home to support our neighbors. So that was and still is a very big help that we give to refugees, although it's very difficult also for us.
Do you sense any strains in Polish society? The cost of living is very high. It's expensive to support this number of people.
Well, according to inflation, it is very difficult right now. The prices are way higher, but we still try to cope. We know it could be worse.
OK, Anna, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much. Anna Mizniak with the Red Cross, and I'm handing back now to Doreen in Doha.
Jonah, thank you. Well, Russians, too, have left in large numbers since the war began. Tens of thousands of young professionals have left to escape conscription or sanctions, or because they simply don't support the war. Ali Hashim reports from Moscow.
The war in Ukraine has changed a lot here. For Dmitry, who asked us to protect his identity, the greatest fear is being called up to serve in the army. He left Russia for Kazakhstan, but didn't stay long.
I was gone for 4 months. It was my longest time away from home. Being in a foreign country is hard, especially when you have no support. The cost of housing and food increased a lot. It became very expensive to live, so I decided to come back home.
Dmitry is still planning to leave, but he's not sure when or where he'll go.
It's still on my mind. It's hard when you don't know what's coming tomorrow. Some of my friends have already left. Some are planning to go. So in fact, there will be very little to keep me here.
Thousands of young Russians have similar stories.
I have worked with international team, and I can't work from Russia because no payment, about no payment with bank system of Russia, so it's a big problem.
The Ministry of Digital Development puts the number of people who have left at 100,000, but says 80% of them are working remotely for Russian companies.
Because some people left, some people came back, and it will take actually a lot of time to understand how many people actually left. Many people who have left are not just junior specialists, they're middle senior specialists, and it will take years upon years of experience for the newcomers on the markets to fill in the gap.
The government is considering various proposals. Incentives are on the table, as are threats to confiscate the property of those who have left. The brain drain isn't new in Russia, but the war has shaped the plans of many young professionals. There is a feeling of unease. And they say, as prospects are so uncertain here, they'll follow their career path to other countries. Ali Hashim, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Well, sanctions have hit Russia's energy sector the hardest. As of this month, the European Union has banned nearly 90% of its total imports of Russian oil products. It's also stopped importing Russian coal. It joins the UK, Canada, and the US, which have banned all Russian oil. The EU has also vowed to cut Russian gas by 2/3 by March. The UK and US have both banned it altogether. And Germany has frozen plans for the opening of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia. After months of negotiations, the EU, G7 nations and Australia agreed to cap Russian crude oil at $60 per barrel and refined products like diesel at $100 a barrel. Now, altogether, the measures are costing Moscow around $175 million a day in lost revenue. That's according to one think tank. Let's speak to Nick Korzenevsky, who's an expert on Russia's economy and the founder of economic data platform Sber Index. He's in Warsaw and joining us live from there. Welcome to Al Jazeera. So have these sanctions had the desired effect that the West was after?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I think the effect of this current round of sanctions was introduced after the 24th of February 22 is having not exactly the expected effect, not the effect that we would usually see once a country falls under sanctions. However, I think ultimately the economic goals of those sanctions either are being reached or will be reached. And the key thing is, there is a destabilization going on right now, primarily. That is occurring in the fiscal space. Russia is losing its fiscal stability very quickly. And that, just as you were saying, there's on one hand a loss of revenue, but on the other hand, there's also expenditures that have ballooned since the start of the war.
Right.
Well, let me give you a couple of numbers. The official forecast of expenditures for this year is $400 billion to be spent. I think it will be closer to $450 billion. The government receipts will be around $350 billion. But what's most interesting, I think, is that just before the war started, the plans of expenditures for this year were officially only $300 billion.
But let me put this to you, because Russia's economy contracted by 4.5% last year, and that's according to the World Bank, which was actually initially predicting an 11.2% contraction. And they're saying that this is thanks to a strong fiscal response as well as high energy prices. So, I mean, to what extent can we say that the economy actually has withstood the effect of sanctions?
The effect is going to be felt long-term and medium-term. So you're perfectly right. Last year was better than many expected. in a sense also because the government expenditure was so high. Government expenditures are directly a part of the GDP. So because they were spending so much, and it's also war-related expenditures, it looked better on the surface. And then I would say that sanctions regarding oil and gas really kicked in only in the fourth quarter. So for about 9 months of last year, the revenues were also okay, and the industry was doing all right.
So as the war approaches that one-year anniversary and now enters its second year, is there any way to sort of measure how much the war is actually costing Russia?
Well, that's whichever way you want to calculate this, but the direct expenditure that they now commit to the war is around $100 billion a year. That's what they have to spend. And then there's also economic losses of output, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that's another $20 to $30 billion a year.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking to us from Warsaw.
Thank you.
Sport also has a role to play in Russia's war on Ukraine. Ukraine's president has threatened to boycott next year's games in Paris after the International Olympic Committee said that it may allow Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete as neutrals. Our sports correspondent Joanna Gazarovska spoke to a former Ukrainian professional tennis player who's now fighting for his country.
Just over a year ago, Sergei Stahovsky's life was filled with professional tennis and spending time with his young family. But his Instagram grid shows how much it has changed. Photos of luxury vacations replaced by images from the front lines of Ukraine's war. His racket and tennis gear swapped for a gun and military fatigues.
The worst thing about being out here is the measure of somebody lost their family member, somebody's lost a friend, families lost their home, parents lost their child. That's what we see daily.
Stahovsky is a member of a mortar unit with Ukraine's National Guard. He's fiercely patriotic and says Russian athletes should be punished for their country's war.
They should ban all Russian and Belarusian athletes worldwide from competing and show them that unless Russia stops this war or invasion of war and slaughter of civilian population of Ukraine, they have no place in a free and democratic world.
But the International Olympic Committee has recently softened its stance, hinting at a way for Russian and Belarusian athletes to return to competition. Ukraine's president has threatened to boycott next year's Paris Olympics and posted these pictures, which show Ukrainian athletes training, surrounded by damaged buildings and sports facilities.
As we prepare for the Paris Olympics, we must be sure that Russia will not be able to use it or any other international sports event to promote aggression. In the first half of the 20th century, too many mistakes were made in Europe that led to very terrible tragedies. There was also a major Olympic mistake. The Olympic movement and terrorist states definitely should not intersect.
Sports diplomacy has played a role in the war from the beginning.
The Russian Grand Prix was removed from the Formula One calendar. The European Champions League final, due to be played in St. Petersburg, was withdrawn from Russia.
Do sports boycotts like that of Russian athletes work?
The degree to which they work depends on what your measure of success is. If the object is to punish a nation state and to force its hand, then not necessarily. The evidence is. A single event is unlikely to do it. It was the longevity of the sporting sanctions against apartheid South Africa that eventually contributed to the change.
Spirit of our army and the spirit of our...
For Stahovsky, sitting in the ruins of his country's capital city, there is no doubt of the role of sports during war.
We all believe that Olympics is fair. It's fair for sport, equal opportunity. There's nothing equal in today's world in Ukraine.
Joanna Gazarovska, Al Jazeera.
And that's it from me, Adrian Finnegan, in Ukraine's capital Kyiv for the moment on this, the first anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a day that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is calling the anniversary of invincibility, determined that this year there'll be victory for his country.
And that's it from me, Darine Aboughaida in Doha, but we'll be back at 1600 hours GMT with another Al Jazeera NewsHour special on the Ukraine war 1 year on, where I'll be joined once again with my colleague Adrian Finnegan from Kyiv on this 1 year anniversary. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.